Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. I'm Haifeng, Assistant Professor of Social Sciences. So before I introduce today's speaker, I would like you to know you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to the questions at the end of the webinar. Now I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Haifeng Qian. Dr. Haifeng Qian is an associate professor and associate director in the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. He is also a senior research fellow at the university's Public Policy Center. He teaches applying the microeconomics, economic development policy. He has published research articles extensively in the areas of entrepreneurship, innovation, urban economic development. Dr. Qian is an editor of Small Business Economics and associate editor of Economic Development Quantity and associate editor of Regional Studies, Regional Science. His research has been awarded funding from Evan Mariel Kaufman Foundation, United States Department of Agriculture, and so on. He won a few highly competitive research awards, including the Best Conference Paper Award from Urban Affairs Association, the Early Career Grants from Regional Studies Association, and the Charles Tybert Prize from Western Regional Science Association. He served as the chair of the North American Regional Science Council. He holds a PhD in public policy, George Mason, and master science degree in management science and engineering from Tsinghua University, and also a bachelor science degree in engineering physics from Tsinghua University. It's glad to welcome Dr. Haifeng Qian.
Okay, thank you for your nice introduction, Professor Huang, and I'm really glad to be here. I don't know what audience I will have, so this talk is more like a kind of a generalized topic. It's not like a very academic. It's more about concepts and ideas. My main research is in the area of economic development, entrepreneurship, innovation, and science technology policies, and this is a part of my main interest. So I will just spend, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40 minutes on the talk, and then I'm happy to take any questions. Seems like we have a very small group here today, and if you want to ask questions during my lecture, I'll be very happy with that as well. So today I'm gonna cover a few topics related to entrepreneurial ecosystem and economic development policy. For those of you who are not very familiar with the concept, so for entrepreneurial ecosystem, it's actually very popular among economic development practitioners or planners in cities. They talk about create this ecosystem in which the entrepreneurs interact with other supporters, and the goal at the end is sort of facilitate the flow of resources that help grow, create and grow businesses. So we talk about entrepreneurial ecosystem today, mainly in the regional context, but also going to mention the different geographic boundaries of ecosystems. For economic development policy, I want to clarify that if you're in the econ department, the economic development is more about international economic development. You would probably look at poverty reduction, health, and some other development issues in developing or underdeveloped countries. here, economic development, I'm talking about regional economic development and particularly US context. So I just want to clarify the boundary I'm looking at today. What I'm going to talk today, I'm going to try to answer 4 questions. The first one is we're trying to look at how entrepreneurial ecosystems, which is a fairly new concept among economic development researchers in the past decade, how this is different from more traditional economic development conceptual framework like regional innovation systems, which has been there for about 3 decades, and also clusters, and which also has been here for a couple of decades. So these concepts, they are more, they're very closely related to entrepreneurial ecosystem, but there's some differences. And the trend appears to be that the entrepreneurial ecosystem is sort of trying to replace these 2 related conceptual framework. My argument here is that they're more like complementary instead of substitutes. But one of the key purpose of this presentation is trying to look at the differences between the 3 frameworks. The second is I'm trying to talk about what are the key findings from the entrepreneurial ecosystem research that are related to economic development policy. The research is really on the topics really broad, and there's like 1,000 articles has been published just within the past decade. Actually, before this, there's a little research on this, but it's more just within a decade, we see 1,000 academic publications on the topic. I'm mainly focused on those that are related to regional economic development policy making. And so I just want to set that boundary. I'm not talking about all kinds of findings, but just look at those related to economic development policy. So the third one is like, after talking about the research, what does this mean for economic development policy? In other words, how economic development policy based on more traditional framework should be adjusted in order to meet the need for growing entrepreneurial ecosystems, right? And the last topic I'm trying to discuss is on the geographic boundaries of entrepreneurial ecosystems. This is also relevant to economic development policy because it's not only related to which level of government should act, but also related to their scope of their efforts. Are they only focused on local, or they trying to build connections between the city and their city and the outside world? So I'm going to talk about the geographic boundary at the end. So keep this in mind. I'll just go these 4 topics one by one. And the first one is, I know I have a really large table here. Just again, for those of you who are not quite familiar with the 3 frameworks, I'm trying to provide a lot of details here. And the goal of this table, of course, is trying to look at how the 3 frameworks are different from each other. So I just go this one by one. And the first one is regional innovation systems. It's sort of the first among the 3 that first established a framework in the literature among the 3. It was first started at national level, but it's quickly being studied at the regional level as well. So one of the definitions for innovation system is just trying to look at all these important factors, including economic factors, social, political, organizational, institutional, those factors that influence the development, diffusion, and the use of innovations. So of course, the focus here is about innovation and also trying to look at the contextual factors, whether it's economic or social or political, how these factors that may impact the different stages of the innovation process. So if you look at the components of innovation system, organizations are at the center of the innovation system. I'm talking about organization, mainly I'm talking about firms, but also include governments, universities that help, that play a very important role in the innovation process. Scholars also talk about formal institution, for instance, the rule of law, the private property rights. These are important in order to have create incentives for innovators. Scholars also talk about informal institutions. The formal ones are more about laws and regulations. The informal is more about traditions, culture, networks, and social capital. These are also quite important. So if you think about innovation, sort of require a lot of collaborations between different players. I'm going to talk about players very soon. So the networks, the social capital, which means the trust among different players, is very important. And culture of risk-taking, whether you're friendly or not friendly to change, because innovation at the end is about change. And that's also very important for the innovation, the effectiveness of the innovation system. And the function of innovation system basically is about learning, and it's not like learning just as you did in the classroom. It's about learning among economic players. Eventually, the goal is trying to facilitate the development and diffusion of innovative products or innovation process. The measurement of outcome of innovation system is either about product innovation, let's say a new smartphone, any kind of innovation, new products you think about. It also includes process innovation, which means a new way of producing things that can improve the productivity in the economy. For innovation systems, it requires the region to have certain knowledge bases in order to have effective innovation system. This includes technology or technical knowledge. It also requires some market knowledge. So when we talk about innovation here, we're not talking about inventions. We talk about commercialized inventions, if you like, or commercialized new knowledge that have market value. So in order to understand whether your new products introduced in the market, whether it may succeed or not, having certain level of market knowledge is important. And innovation systems, of course, is important to managing large firms in particular, where most innovation happens, right? So for industry boundaries, innovation system is typically discussed within one industry. For instance, there's a lot of literature look at a regional innovation system in a city for its biotech sector. Others look at the IT sector in Silicon Valley, for instance. So there's a clear industry boundary of this. The key player here is in terms of firms. These are like innovative and high-tech firms where R&D and innovative products are introduced. In terms of different players, I talk about 4 sets of players. One is entrepreneurs. The second is about incumbent firms. Those are like a typical large, big firms. They have been there for a while. I'm going to also talk about the role of government and the role of universities. And in the innovation system, the leading player is about large incumbent firms where private R&D happens. And the role of government is also important because the government, we know that there's a lot of resources in terms of funding R&D research, R&D activities, and they also play a leading role. And we also know that the government are providing funding, but typically provide funding through universities and other research institutions that really create this new knowledge. We typically see a linear model of innovation is that you see the government funding of basic research, universities conduct this research, have some patents, and then sort of the private businesses trying to do the development part, which is not basic research, but it's more sort of applied research that can directly ties to some kind of a commercial potentials. So this is what we call like a triple helix model in the case of innovation system, looking at sort of the 3 main pillars of the innovation system, this including incumbent firms, governments, and universities. For clusters, I probably spent too much time on this, but the rest two will be relatively easier. For clusters, the most influential work was done by Michael Pollard, and the definition is about geographic concentration of interconnected firms and institutions in a particular field. I know there's I use institutions in different columns, but this kind of here, the institution is not about rules or laws or regulations. This is really about other organizations, like universities and government is also part of the clusters. And it's very similar in terms of components, in terms of organizations, formal and informal institutions. They're very similar between clusters and innovation systems. For clusters, they do not necessarily look at high-tech firms, innovative firms. More importantly, is that the firms are growing. Excuse me, the firms are growing. The term used by Michael Pollard is to build competitive firms. By competitive, mostly we think about firms in your region. Can you have a higher market share compared with similar firms in other regions? So the goal here in terms of outcome is trying to produce as many nationally or internationally competitive firms as a region can. The knowledge base are also quite similar. All these 3 types of knowledge are used. One difference between cluster and innovation system is that clusters, it not only involve one industry, it involves multiple interconnected industries. For instance, we have, let's say, automobile assembly industry or car manufacturers. A typical cluster not only include car assembly industry, but also include just like parts suppliers, like tire producers, or some other suppliers. It may also include some other supporting services, consulting, things like that. Depends on how closely other industries are close to the focal industry you're looking at. So in terms of industry boundaries, it involves multiple industry, but you still can clearly define cluster based on the industry framework. We just have to look at the connection between industries as well. The core firm here is about export-based firm. This is ties to traditional economic development theories. What is important is, in the region, another firms that produce service or products to local customer base is those produce products or services to outside customers, because by doing that, when you export, you bring in external money into your region, so you have economic growth. In terms of the role of these major factors I just mentioned, major players I just mentioned, there's only one player that are highlighted in clusters, that is incumbent businesses. Entrepreneurs play a supporting role. Government and university also play a supporting role. So this is really about market approach to economic development, where businesses are at the core of driving economic growth. Entrepreneurial ecosystem, it's as I mentioned, kind of a new concept just from last decades. I started to work on this very early for I wrote a dissertation on this topic, but at that point, almost nobody worked on this topic. But it's really a very useful framework to understand how cities and regions can create environments to have productive entrepreneurship. So I just provide one definition. So entrepreneurial ecosystem can be understood as a set of interdependent actors and factors coordinated in such a way that enable productive entrepreneurship. Actors here, we talk about, I have 4 set of actors I mentioned for the other 2 framework. These are also main actors. I also do want to mention that in entrepreneurial ecosystem, we also talk a lot about the entrepreneurship support organizations, as you may have heard of the business incubators and business accelerators, and some other economic development organizations that focus on entrepreneurship. Factors here, we talk about regional factors. I'm going to give a couple of framework. These are the environmental factors like your business environment, your endowments in terms of knowledge, human capital, etc. I'm going to talk more about this later on. The key point is like we see these factors and actors, they're interconnected. And the goal here is trying to grow productive entrepreneurship. I want to mention in terms of components, entrepreneurial ecosystems are very different from the other 2 framework because people are at the center of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we look at entrepreneurs in particular. If you think about entrepreneurs, when they start a company, they may not be affiliated with any other organizations. They may just be individuals, but these are the core players in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we really need to highlight entrepreneurial ecosystem is people-based, and therefore the policies should also be people-based. And the function of entrepreneurial ecosystem is about explore potential market opportunities by entrepreneurs. There's many sources of market opportunities. A big part of this we're looking at this new technology, commercialize this to sort of have disruptive impacts in the market, but meanwhile also improve productivity, right? So the matter of outcome here is we look at productive startups as well as productive scale-ups. The scale-ups is really the high growth firms. Let's say your sales can double within 4 years. That's how we define like a high growth firms. These are really the function of the ecosystem is trying to create as many productive startups possible, meanwhile also grow them within relatively short amount of time. I want to mention in terms of knowledge base, there's one new set of knowledge base are very important to entrepreneurial ecosystem, which is what we call entrepreneurial process knowledge. this is about how to create a company, how to grow a company, and how to, get connected with investors, etc. This is really about the business creation process. Because the business creation, if you look at that kind of a knowledge, that can actually apply to all different industries. So for entrepreneurial ecosystem, we typically just look at the regional boundary, really not talk about industry boundaries, because all this kind of knowledge can be applied to different industries. The same set of entrepreneurial process knowledge can be applied to different industries. And the role of entrepreneurs play a leading role in entrepreneurial ecosystems. So if you look at the successful ecosystems, they're not like a government play a major role. So what has been the most important contributors are this star entrepreneurs not only create high-profile startups, but also because their participation, their role in mentoring, their role in investing in other startups in the businesses, they really play a leading role to create a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem. And in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the incumbent firms, they really are playing a supporting role by, for instance, we know a lot of startups are created by employees of, a decade-old tech firms. They really supply talent. The incumbent firms do supply talent into the ecosystem, and also in many ways supply knowledge, because we know most R&D occurred within a large incumbent firm, but they're not commercialized all the R&D outputs, and some of this are spillward to startups. And the role of government and universities, likewise, they also just play a supporting role in entrepreneurial ecosystems. I spent a lot of time on this slide, and just trying to get, just in case you're not familiar with this, what I'm talking about in terms of the three frameworks, I'm trying to provide more, background about this. So the second topic, as I mentioned, I hope you get some good understanding how the three frameworks are different from each other through this gigantic table here. The next topic I'm going to talk about, so what are the main findings from this entrepreneurial ecosystem research that are directly related to economic development policy. And a major part of entrepreneurial ecosystem research is trying to identify these factors, what I just mentioned, these factors that are important to productive entrepreneurship. And these factors are typically geographically bounded, right? So there's so many frameworks, I cannot cover every of them. Because this is kind of a systematic framework, it's not very difficult, to identify a unique set of factors based on like one particular case study. I just give two examples. One is by Stem and Vanderman, looking at the ecosystem here is the big box below here. The outcome is about productive entrepreneurship, as I just mentioned. The ecosystem in this framework at least separate two sets of factors. One of this is about institutional factor, the other is about resources factor. The institutional factor including formal institutions, again, law, regulations, and also cultural, this is like informal institutions and networks. And the resource endowments, these are the resources that are important to productive entrepreneurship. This including physical infrastructure. The infrastructure can also be non-physical in some way, in the sense of, or I should say non-traditional. For instance, universities can be considered as part of the infrastructure. It's sort of provide some soft skills to the ecosystem instead of have the physical, like roads and broadband. That's kind of a physical infrastructure, right? Local market demand. The intermediaries. These are important connectors in the ecosystem, connecting entrepreneurs with investors. For instance, talents are very important. Not only about entrepreneurial talents themselves, but also startups. They need hire coding person, for instance. These are talents needed. Knowledge related to talent, leadership are very important, and of course, at the end, financing startups. Finance available for startups are very important. A more traditional, I shouldn't say traditional, but it's kind of the first framework talk about entrepreneurial ecosystem, look at a different set of factors, but you can see a lot of overlaps between these two frameworks. For instance, this one by Eisenberg, which is kind of a classic framework of entrepreneurial ecosystem, talk about policy, finance, culture, all kinds of supports here. Human capital is important, and markets. And these are the factors. And of course, you can also look at this from the perspective of actors. You can think about who are playing a role in all these factors that are presented here. There's a more framework, a lot of new frameworks based on like a new case study. I'll just point out two here, just give you some idea like what kind of factors are important to entrepreneurial ecosystems. The second set of entrepreneurial ecosystem research topics I think is important to economic development policy is about evolution of the ecosystems. There's a two approach to look at this. One, for some scholars, they argue that if you do not have a strong entrepreneurial activity in your city, you do not have an ecosystem. But more often, it's we sort of the ecosystem, we assume the ecosystem is everywhere. It's just some of them are, underdeveloped, others are more developed. One of this framework is by Spiegel and Harrison, trying to look at all different kind of the actors here and connections. We don't even need to read all of this, what these like different symbols represent, but it represents different actors, like most importantly, that's firms, startups, anchor organizations, training programs, other programs related to startups. But the point here I want to make is that some cities just start to grow their ecosystem. They kind of have some connections between, for instance, entrepreneurs and their supporters, but the connections are kind of weak. There's also little recycling of resources. We talk about resources, these are including, for instance, capital, and also talents, of course. Because there's not a strong ecosystem, even if there's some like a locally grown resources, they may leak to other more advanced ecosystems. And the ecosystem can grow for whatever reason, and part of this I'm going to talk about is through economic development policy, can grow to a more like a growing stage, or in Spiegel's terms, a strengthening ecosystem, where you sort of have a stronger connections between different players or actors. You have more resources recycled within the region, again, mostly about capital and talents, and also start to attract some like entrepreneurial resources from other cities or other regions. And a mature stage would be you have a self-sustaining ecosystem in which all these resources needed can be locally grown and locally recycled. There's a very strong networks between different actors, and you also are able to attract a lot of talents and financial resources from other entrepreneurial ecosystem. This is in their framework called resilient ecosystem. Others call this mature ecosystems. And regardless of the term, these are the things. These are the ecosystem we talk, for instance, Silicon Valley, New York, etc. We also know that some ecosystems are growing, but if they, for whatever reason, maybe for lost a major entrepreneurial player, they may weaken instead of keep growing into the resilient ecosystem. If we look at the history, Detroit, for instance, a long time ago, actually, there's a lot of startups. When they grow the automobile industry there's a very strong entrepreneurial culture. But at some point, this culture just stopped because of the inertia, the huge advantage created by this big automobile firms. This is just one reason that ecosystem can be weakened, but there could be other reasons as well. So these are important because we know that if you, for instance, the Silicon Valley, there's really not much like efforts are needed from the economic development policy makers because they already have everything. What's really important for economic development policy makers to play a role is in the nascent stage, or also include the strengthening stage. I'm going to talk more about this later on. For entrepreneurial ecosystem, because the focus is on people or individuals, there's an equity dimension of this. if you think about this traditional framework, looking at innovation systems and clusters, their main focus about businesses. They don't look at people, but once you start to look at people, you see this disparities in terms of access to opportunities and resources are different by different population groups. For instance, there's a lot of literature looking at minority entrepreneurship, where it typically reports that the minority entrepreneurs have less access to main resources for successful creation of startups or growing startups. We also have evidence that women also have are less likely to access the especially large fundings, but some other entrepreneurial support resources as well. So these are the have important implications in the sense, at least from equity perspective, because we know that the marginalized group are likely being cannot access adequate resources in the ecosystem. That's where the economic development policymakers may play a role from equity perspective. So I sort of answer the second question. I talk about some like entrepreneurial ecosystem research that are relevant to economic development policy. I have not talked about policy yet. I'm trying to sort of now connect that to the policy piece. And speaking of policy, because we look at I talk about this in the context of economic development policy, so I'm just trying to give more information about the economic development policy, the mainstream framework. So the practitioners in economic development, as well as scholars, kind of traditionally look at economic development policy through the lens of three waves. The first wave is before 1980s. It's the traditional smokestack chasing approach. Basically, for instance, the state government and local government providing incentives, for instance, a tax abatement or grants, trying to poach business from other regions because it's incentives. You know, they kind of lower costs for businesses. They may move to a region where they can create jobs and expand tax base. This is still very popular these days. I need to point that out. It's called first wave. Now, I'm not saying they're no longer relevant today. It's just that this is when they start to become popular. The second wave is looking at providing incentives for local businesses, because this typically require less public dollars compared with this, attract business from another city or another region. The third wave is really what we look at that I think are very important for long-term economic development. There's a different terms of this, but I like to call this a capacity building approach. It's really trying to grow your capacity, not just look at the jobs, not just look at GDP or number of businesses. This is about strategic planning. It's about creating partnerships and networks. It's about grow clusters. It's also about adequate physical or software infrastructures. This capacity building approach is actually very relevant to what the innovation system scholars and cluster scholars have been talking about in terms of what are innovation system policy or the cluster policies. So, for instance, the innovation system policy typically are tied to public R&D investment, support for universities, and also fostering cultural collaboration, especially among government, universities, and private businesses. Cluster policy, similarly, looking at collaboration, networks, the adequate infrastructure for businesses to grow their competitiveness, and also university and college communities that can provide a lot of talents and knowledge to the cluster. So that being said, talk about the traditional economic development policy approach, and also I talk about entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now the question is, given the popularity of entrepreneurial ecosystem research, does economic development policy need some realignment to the new or growing entrepreneurial ecosystem research? My argument here is that this traditional economic development policy based on clusters and innovation systems are almost sufficient for entrepreneurial ecosystem. I have a few reasons why. For one, there's a large overlaps between entrepreneurial ecosystem elements. I showed like two examples earlier. And if you think about the table I presented earlier, actually a lot of these elements And also, if you think about this table, a lot of these elements, they're actually very similar to clusters or innovation system. So I can name a few. For instance, human capital is important for all of the three frameworks. Infrastructures are important for all these frameworks, and networks are important for all these frameworks. And also, our argument here is that entrepreneurial ecosystem does not replace innovation system or cluster. It's really about substitutes. They're not substitutes. It's really about complements. If you think about the outcomes, innovation system look at innovative firms, clusters look at competitive firms that are not necessarily innovative, and entrepreneurial ecosystem really look at startups. So because the outcome are different, they're really about their relationship can be best described as complements instead of substitutes. So we do not want to shift the resources for innovation systems, for instance, to entrepreneurial ecosystems. And also the literature tells us that there's no one-size-fits-all entrepreneurial ecosystem policy. And in many ways, if you don't know what to do, the best way is, best response probably is do nothing, at least to do no harm. We also know that the most vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems, they're not liked by policymakers, they're liked by entrepreneurs. So this is kind of a limited role for economic development policymakers anyway. So all this said, we just need to make some incremental adjustment, I would say, to economic development policy in order to accommodate the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach. So I summarize this new, not super new economic development policy. I think it's just a sum of small things. I want to give I want to mention this sum of small things. It's not invented by myself. It's a book title. You can Google sum of small things. It's also a book about economic development. So I'll just give a few examples about what small things can be done by economic development policymakers to help build a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. One of this, very importantly, is promote and celebrate entrepreneurship. And I particularly want to mention this because if you talk with a lot of economic development policymakers, most of them are still talking about tax base, like attract large businesses to their region, and the support for startups and entrepreneurs are sort of their secondary priority. My argument here is that really needs to be one of the top priorities at least, because we know that it's a relatively lower cost and also can have a very important long-term impacts for regional economic development. The promotion and celebration, there's really many different ways, but really, it can be in the government documents, but can also be, in some public events. The policymakers highlights the importance of entrepreneurship or help marketing local businesses is all relevant. And the second thing I want to mention, small thing I want to mention, is the participating in ecosystem events and listen to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs have different needs and also depends on city. For instance, we know that these high-tech startups in particular, they want to be in the places where it's easy to be connected to other entrepreneurs or supporters. We see this location, this best location typically are in the downtown of a city. And we know that the downtown space is often limited for some city, including Iowa City here. We also know that a lot of space are actually publicly owned by the local government. And if that's the case, the government really can play an important role just by offering this space to entrepreneurs or to entrepreneurship support organizations with below market rents. And that's going to help a lot to the ecosystem. This applies to some cities, but not necessarily apply to other cities. What really important is that you want to talk with your entrepreneurs first and to see what are their needs, and then see what resources you have and try to help meet their needs accordingly. And third thing I want to mention, kind of related to the second one, they're also sort of related in some way, is support ecosystem events and entrepreneurship organizations. in Iowa City here, we have a number of like a regular entrepreneurship events. For instance, we have this 1 million cup every Wednesday morning. That's a local entrepreneur present their ideas to an audience, get some feedback, and we also even can get some investors investment. And supporting these events are important. It's like really low cost for the government because most cases they can just offer space. Other cases, just provide some funding for coffee, for instance. That's really low cost. And similarly, local government can, as already mentioned, can provide space for entrepreneurship support organizations. And the last thing I want to mention is that even though this can be best done by the star entrepreneurs in the city, if there's not many star entrepreneurs, the local government really can also play a role in terms of connecting ecosystem participants. I mentioned that the network is super important to entrepreneurial ecosystem, and these connections can be grow through some like large events, but also can be just some kind of ad hoc connections by the policymakers. The goal here is, of course, trying to build a strong network where different resources needed for startups can be connected together. So if you think about all this, there's nothing really big or require fundamental change in terms of economic development policy. That's why I call this is just a sum of small things. All right, I'll very quickly finish the last slide, talk about geographic boundaries of ecosystems. So if you look at the literature, the majority looking at the regional dimension, because if you think about the, how this different players are connected, they mostly connected to local actors, right? So there's a regional dimension of this, but there's also literature look at the so-called national entrepreneur ecosystems. And similarly, there's a literature look at so-called digital entrepreneur ecosystem, where the space does not needed at all. It's related to the platform economy. For instance, there can be a lot of startups just on a large platform. My argument here is that entrepreneurial ecosystem boundary can be best defined by network boundaries, because it's really about network that can facilitate the flow of resources. You probably can imagine that in the nascent stage of ecosystem, the boundary is relatively small. Most likely it's just constrained to local players. But once it starts to grow, the local resources not enough. They may need resources from other places. So the boundaries start to expand. And in a very mature ecosystem, again, if you think about New York and Silicon Valley, they not only have using local resources, local investments, their scope is really national or even international. So we can say there's a Silicon Valley entrepreneurial ecosystem, but if you look at the connections between firms there or startups there and who are their supporters, it's not only local, but to some extent even global. And because of this, this is what I just mentioned, because of this, the economic development policy needs to really adjust for the changing entrepreneurial ecosystem boundaries. In the early stage, the scope can be just local, but once the ecosystem is starting taking off, when the external resources are needed, the policymakers really needs to also look at the resources outside, have a broader scope of their targets. They can connect local entrepreneurs to resources in other cities, and I'm talking about more advanced ecosystems, of course. So the economic development policy needs to be adjusted once the ecosystem is growing to a more mature stage. I think that's my last slide. This is just not a traditional, I guess, academic research. It's more just trying to talk about these concepts, how they're different, how they're relevant to economic development policy, what policymakers can learn from this, as well as be adjusted when we are facing a changing ecosystem that from the nascent stage to more mature stage. I hope this is helpful, and I'm happy to take some questions.
think Professor Qian gave a very interesting presentation about the entrepreneurial ecosystem, especially compared to the regional innovation systems and clusters. So currently we open to the questions, so to see if any questions. So my first question actually is, since you spend quite a few time to talk at the table, I feel it's very interesting table, and also it's very helpful table. So so for that table, I think so I think as I'm understand this expertise about like regional innovation systems, cluster and entrepreneurial ecosystems. The cluster is still part of the cluster, and the regional innovation system is more like a government driven. So it's the whole like national regional innovation system, but at different spatial scales. So the regional innovation system is more like at the federal or central level, and the cluster is more like a local and regional level. So I think the clusters is more like the university and the governments is more like local and regional governments playing the leading role instead of the federal government. So especially when you mentioned the measure of outcomes. So, and consider the entrepreneur ecosystems is more like look at the individual business role. So could you give more details like how interact between this individual business and the respectively local and regional government and the national federal government roles different in the entrepreneur ecosystems?
Yeah, the innovation system, it's actually started with the national innovation systems and the conceptual framework, because the federal government really play a very important role in the innovation in this country by offer large-scale research and development fundings to mostly through universities, but also through large firms as well. So if you think about how Boston and Silicon Valley become what they are today, the high-tech center, they're driven by really large spending, especially defense or military spending in these two cities. So if we talk about federal role, it's more important, I would say, in the innovation system than the other two. This public R&D, of course, have implications on the other two as well, but they're mostly directly related to the innovation systems. And the skill here, I talk about mostly regional. I'm talking about at least we talk about local anchor universities and also local incumbent firms. And the funding here is from, if we talk about government funding, this doesn't have to be local. Actually, most funding again coming from the federal government. So I would expand this government here to not just like a local government, but it's government at different levels. For cluster, I think it's mostly about local phenomenon instead of federal. It's hard to say what the cluster of the United States has, right? We have to talk about more subnational level. We know there's a high-tech cluster in Silicon Valley. We know it's a very strong medical cluster in Boston, but we cannot say this for the entire country. So I would say the clusters is a very localized concept. But still the role, I talk about some policies that are relevant for clusters, for instance, strengthening the universities and the infrastructure. This also can, the federal government also can play a big role to provide fundings for universities and large-scale infrastructures. This is what's happening in the past 2 years in particular. So I would say that the federal government also play a role, but I do want to mention, at least in the framework clusters, these roles are supporting, not as important as in the innovation systems. For clusters, we can also say this for instance, shoemaking cluster. There's nothing high tech about it. There's maybe a lot of supporters, other supporters like suppliers. There's some knowledge related to that as well. But it's hard to say there's federal dollars to support a shoe cluster. But shoe clusters can still be very important to those places that specialize in this, and they export that, they bring in extra money to their cities. The entrepreneur ecosystems, eventually it's really about entrepreneurs, or successful entrepreneurs in particular. I would say compared with the other two, the role for government is even less. Although these main factors we talk about in terms of human capital, universities and infrastructure, they're also very important in the ecosystems. But most ecosystem scholars argue that if you do want to have a very strong ecosystem, you need to have star entrepreneurs that lead the ecosystem by create multiple successful firms by investing and mentoring other startups in the city, etc. So it's more a market-based approach, if you like. I'm not quite sure it answers your question.
No, I think it's good. It's pretty good to address the questions very well. So I think the other following this question, actually, could you show the I think you mentioned several elements of the ecosystems. So for that elements, how do you think the regional innovation mechanisms will actually affect the significance of each element?
The regional
regional innovation systems mechanisms.
Oh, okay.
Such as actually you the knowledge basis, absorptive capacity, competition, or network of people, diversity, culture. These things how actually will affect the variation of these elements' significance.
It depends on the knowledge base. I think a cluster makes the same argument. It depends on what type of cluster you're talking about. The elements are not the same. I mean, in terms of their importance, at least. So if it's highly driven by this high-tech industries, clearly a strong talent and the soft infrastructure and universities, this can be more important than if we talk about, again, I can go back to the shoe clusters where the knowledge base does not as important. I would say that this also literature shows that even though there's so many elements are discussed in the literature, even for some cities, they do not have certain elements presenting this framework, they still can be very successful. There's a different combinations of elements can all lead to some kind of a successful entrepreneur ecosystems. There's a lot of varieties there. I think it's really, that's why you see, if you look at the literature, the case study is still the mainstream approach because they do require kind of different resources. And even for the same, like a sectoral focus, we also actually find that the different combination of elements it doesn't have to be just one combination of elements. It can be different combinations. I would say if it's more innovation-based, the combination of elements may be very different from if it's less innovation-based clusters or ecosystems.
Okay, thank you. So I think the other question is about you mentioned the ecosystem innovation. So then for that innovation, I think you mentioned the lesson ecosystems then goes to strengthening ecosystems, then is weakening ecosystems, and also playing a role is the minority and also women entrepreneurship equity. So then how the minority entrepreneurship and the women entrepreneurship the role change during this innovation process. So could you give more?
You talk about the evolution process at different stage of this?
Yeah.
It's I'm not quite sure this part of literature are connected to the evolution. I'm talking about the equity dimension of this are connected to evolution.
Yeah, how the minority and the women.
We know that the network, for instance, there's some case study of Chicago, by the way, talk about this like a high-tech entrepreneurs. They are overwhelmingly white male. They overwhelmingly have access to these incubators and accelerators in Chicago. It's a comparative study, Chicago and Orlando, but pretty much show the same results. I don't remember that study talk about different stages, but if we talk about network, is that we know that the minority and women entrepreneurs, they are less likely to be main part of this network. The network is one thing, but what's behind network is the access to different resources. And because you are not main part of the network, you also are less likely to access these main resources. The argument I'm trying to make here is that because they're in a disadvantaged position, that they sort of, I wouldn't say ignored, but it's kind of a marginalized in the ecosystem. That's where the economic development policymakers can play a role. For one, they can provide more resources to minority and women entrepreneurs who are not adequately funded or helped by the ecosystem. Or two, is trying to create some incentives in the ecosystem that help minority and women entrepreneurs to better integrate it in the system. In the long term, I think the second approach is more important. Or you can, for instance, government can create incentives to entrepreneurship support organizations if they have a more inclusive or diverse clients. So that's where I think it really matters to economic development policy. That's why I'm talking about this equity dimension here, because the policy can make a difference from this perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. So so I think the last question is you're talking about the last slides about the geographic boundary and network boundaries. So as mentioned just now, you mentioned the minority women, minority entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and women entrepreneurships in these different stages. Most important is access to different resources. So and then how actually these geographic boundaries and network boundaries may help Angel sometimes is a hindrance for the access to different resources.
Yeah, I'm not sure that whether this is more an equity issue than the evolution issue, because it's once the ecosystem is growing, their network boundary at least is expanding. The point here I'm trying to make is that the policymakers, when they look at the resources or build connections, if the network boundary is expanding, or they can also even help expand the network boundaries. And that's where I think that matters. So the greater the boundary, the greater geographic scope economic development efforts should be. I think that apply both to minority entrepreneurship or or just, entrepreneurship in general. Of course, we can also make an argument that if minority entrepreneurs, let's say, are even less likely to access resources from outside than compared with the access to local resources, maybe then there's a role for policymakers to, particularly help them to be connected with the external resources. It's maybe intertwined, but I'm more curious to talk about intertwined with the evolutionary stage and the geographic boundary here.
Okay, thank you. Professor Qian gave a great presentation. Not usually last we give applause to the speakers. Thank you for the excellent presentations.
All right, thank you.